second to accept all the participants. I don't know why we have to accept each of you individually today. And then we can start. So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. So as I said, it is available in English and in Spanish today. So it is the third episode of our series of webinars that we are organizing jointly between NEC and CICA. The first one was an introduction to NEC contracts, and the second one focused on the early contractor involvement. You can still watch the replays if you have missed them. And today we will focus more on disputes and mainly avoidance of disputes under NEC and more specifically maybe NEC 4 contract. And we will have also a focus on Peru and Latin America. So we are very happy to have with us today 3 panelists. So our first speaker, Mr. Patrick Waterhouse, will present the general mindset and contractual framework with NEC 4 to avoid and resolve disputes. Then we will continue with a conversation between Augusto Gutierrez and Alvaro Beckdorf on how the NEC contracts are being used more and more in Peru with practical considerations from a contractor's perspective with Grupo Flesan. So as usual, we will keep some time at the end of the session for your questions, but you can already type some questions in the chat if you wish. So first I will introduce Patrick. So Patrick Waterhouse is a construction adjudicator, mediator, and contracts consultant. He has worked with NEC contracts since their first publication in 1993. He is a trainer and examiner for the NEC Project Manager Accreditation Program, and he was part of the team that wrote the NEC 4 contracts. So Patrick, many thanks to be with us today, and I will let you share your slides and make this first presentation.
Okay, thank you, Fanny. So hopefully you will see a picture of a large highway interchange on the screen.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I was about to say good afternoon, everybody, but recognizing there may be people in South America, good morning as well. A beautiful sunny day here in Manchester in the UK. For those of you who know Manchester, you'll know that when the sun comes out, it's quite a rare occurrence. So here's my details. I won't waste your time with those. You've just had an introduction, but if you get these slides afterwards, there's a contact for you there if you need it. So in the short time I've got with you today, I'm going to look at how we avoid disputes, the NEC provisions that contribute to dispute avoidance, some recommendations that I have for people who work with NEC contracts as to how you might avoid disputes, and unfortunately, if you've not been able to do that, how you might resolve them. So I think for most people dealing with contracts, we know what a dispute is. It's more than a difference of opinion between the parties to the contract. It usually involves money, but frequently it also involves time. It might involve defective work. And the contract is always at the basis of our disputes because that's the legal entitlement that both parties have. So how to avoid disputes is a number of things that you can do. And these next couple of slides aren't just about NEC. This is about any contract you might work with. But certainly you'll see how this leads into the provisions that NEC contracts have. Getting your contract documents right is always valuable. We often see contracts put out to tender in far too much of a hurry when the client team has insufficient time to do the job properly for whatever reason. And those issues tend to create problems long term. We need contracts that include early warning mechanisms where the parties have an obligation to warn each other of the possible problems that lie ahead. It's better that the contracts have requirements in for effective project management that have clear payment terms. We all go to work to earn money, The shareholders in private companies invest in those companies to make a profit. Clients in projects, even if they are public sector clients who don't make a profit, have budgets to maintain. So it's imperative that contracts have clear payment terms that clearly set out what entitlement parties have in terms of making and receiving payments. Communications are vital. We now communicate largely electronically. Are we any better at communicating electronically than we were on paper 30 years ago? I'm not always convinced that we are, and communications in terms of dealing with people still heavily relies on talking to one another, be that in person, be that on the telephone or on a Teams call. But we need to make sure that the products of those conversations are recorded in some way. And finally, I think that the use of independent people for avoiding conflict and for resolving it is absolutely vital. We all have a vested interest if we are a party to a contract, and we don't always listen to what the other party may say to us because we know that they've got a vested interest. So the sooner that we can use independent people to try and avoid problems, and if we failed in that to resolve them, I think the better. So once we have a contract, the very best advice I can give you, regardless of which contract you use, is to do what it says in the contract. You have made obligations to promises to the other party. You should be honouring those. Usually in disputes, I read large submissions by both parties, each of them telling me that the other one hasn't done what they said they would do. Usually it's true, usually it's exaggerated, but you often read these things and think, well, why did these people do this thing, or why did they not do this thing? So doing what the contract says at an absolute minimum is something you should do. Keep communicating, keep talking to one another, formally and informally. Work together on issues such as planning, programming, and the assessment of the impact of change. If you have early warning systems in the contract, then that goes back to the earlier point, do what it says. And even if they're not in the contract, consider using them anyway. If you are a party that owes the other one money, then pay them the right amount and pay it on time. That reduces a lot of stress on our projects. You're going to see shortly that NEC contracts have dispute avoidance processes that step up in terms of the effort and the cost of dealing with processes, then use them. Don't go straight to a formal legal process if you have a semi-formal process that you can rely on instead. And as I said on the previous slide, bring in neutrals quickly. If your negotiations don't work, then look at how a third party might help. NEC doesn't refer expressly to mediation, but there is always the opportunity for it. Think how cheap mediation is when you settle through mediation than taking something to a more formal process. So, how do we avoid disputes? Well, there's some controversial advice here. Select your people very carefully. You can have the best contract in the world, but if you don't have good people to run those contracts, you will suffer. Remove people from your projects if their behaviours do not align with your values and with the need to collaborate. I see occasionally in mediation when the very senior figures from a construction contract party come to a mediation and they learn about the way some of their employees have behaved on a project, I see them absolutely horrified at what they've learned about their colleagues' behaviour. But why has it taken a big dispute for them to find out that the wrong people are in their company? We need good people to avoid disputes. And this is an NEC specific piece of advice. Get rid of your project managers if they are not the right people for the job. It is a crucial role in NEC contracts. the project manager in the engineering and construction contract, and there are service managers in the service contracts and other similar figures. If you've got the wrong person there, it can cost you a fortune. And I did an adjudication last year where the wrong person had been supported in a job, making bad decisions for over 2 years. And he cost his client, because he didn't even work for the employer, he cost his client over £6 million through the bad decisions he had made, because he was just the wrong person. He had the wrong behaviours. He did not understand what the contract said, and he was permanently seeking confrontation. So there you go. So I'm now going to look at NEC provisions that contribute to dispute avoidance. NEC contracts have a lot in them that's more akin to project management procedure. And it's part of one of the 3 NEC objectives, which is to stimulate good management. And the contracts require parties to behave in a certain manner. And where they collaborate with one another, the contract works really well. So what do the NEC contracts say about dispute avoidance primarily? Well, let's go right to the end of the process first and look at what dispute resolution looks like. There are 3 dispute resolution options in the contract. There's actually, just springing to mind doing this now, there is actually a 4th one in the Hong Kong version of the NEC construction contract. But I'll leave that aside for now. But 2 of these provisions rely on adjudication. And the first thing to note is that the title of the dispute provisions actually uses the word avoidance before it uses the word resolution. And all 3 of the options in the engineering and construction contract contain avoidance first prior to any formal legal process. Options W1 and W2 are very similar. W2 has been amended from W1 to comply with legislation in the UK. I'm just going to ignore W2 for the rest of today, because W1 is the dispute option you're likely to follow in most parts of the world rather than the UK. Now, W1 starts off with the dispute, or the potential dispute, being referred to the people we call the senior representatives. These, as the name suggests, are senior figures in each of the 2 parties. They get to meet. They have a brief statement of case given to them, no more than 10 sides of paper. They get to meet, and the contract says they can use any process they want to try and agree a resolution to the potential dispute. And although it doesn't say so, that would obviously include the ability to bring in an external mediator. The senior representatives can reduce the list of disputes or remove them entirely, but at the end of their time-limited process, one of the parties can take this dispute to adjudication, to refer it to an independent adjudicator for resolution in a time-limited process. If either of the parties comes out of adjudication dissatisfied with the decision, they can refer the dispute to the tribunal. The tribunals identified in the contract is either arbitration or the courts. And there are strict time limits on all of those things, strict time limits on bringing the dispute from becoming aware it exists, all the way through each of these processes. And you cannot refer your dispute into adjudication until the senior representatives have had enough time to deal with it. Jumping to W3, this is what we call a dispute avoidance board. It does not resolve anything. It makes recommendations, having heard submissions from the parties. It's a permanently constituted board, similar to what some of you may have come across in FIDIC, except it doesn't make decisions. It only makes recommendations. And if one or both of the parties is dissatisfied with the recommendations, then they can refer the matter to the tribunal, which is to the courts or to arbitration. So who decides the outcome? In the first 2 options, W1 and W2, the senior representatives get an opportunity to resolve it. So in other words, the parties are still in control of their own dispute at this point. Failing that, the adjudicator makes a decision, and then if it goes to the tribunal, it's either a judge in court or an arbitrator. With W3, the dispute board makes recommendations that aren't binding on the parties, and then the dispute will go to court or to arbitration. So the parties lose control of their process once one of them refers it to the tribunal. So with adjudication, there are time limits. Everything virtually everything in an NEC contract has a time limit. And that is another way of trying to avoid disputes. It's to make the parties deal with issues as and when they arise. And there are time limits for referring a potential dispute to the senior representatives. Typically, that's 4 weeks. There's then a time limit following their period when matters can be referred to the adjudicator. That's 2 weeks. The adjudicator is independent and then has 56 days to make the decision. That can be extended by agreement. The adjudicator's decision is then binding on the parties, but not necessarily final. And subcontract disputes, where they are effectively the same dispute as the one under a main contract, can be brought in and joined to the main contract dispute as well. The tribunal is named in contract data, either arbitration or the courts, and something that I think is relatively rare in construction contracts. You cannot refer your dispute to the tribunal until the adjudicator has issued a decision on that dispute. There is no jurisdiction to take the matter either to court or to arbitration until the adjudicator has issued a decision. And the parties have 4 weeks after the adjudicator's decision to notify each other they are dissatisfied with it. If they don't do that within 4 weeks, then the decision made by the adjudicator becomes final and binding, and there is no recourse to court or to arbitration. And in W3, we go to the tribunal once the recommendations of the Dispute Avoidance Board have not been accepted by both parties. Now, we rely heavily on documents. I think most of us don't print them out fully nowadays, but I think this picture always demonstrates a good story. The contract documents have to be right in any contract to give you a chance of avoiding dispute, because where they're wrong, typically one party will benefit from an error and the other party will lose as a result of that error. So within NEC contracts, there are a number of constituent documents that the contract refers to. The contract data, there are 2 parts to it with all of the specific data you need to run the contract. Part 1 is put together by the client, typically before tender, and part 2 is put together by the contractor, usually as part of the tender process. And when the contract is formed, the 2 parts of the contract data come together. There will be a pricing document depending on which of the 6 main options has been chosen for the contract. That will be an activity schedule or a bill of quantities. And then possibly the most important document, I think, in a contract is the scope, what you might see called the specification in other contracts, and it specifies and describes the works that are being done. It states any constraints on how the contractor does that. It might contain written documents, it might contain drawings, and it can be provided by both parties. Where the contractor has design obligations, it will have written part of the scope at tender stage, which will go into the contract. There is a document called site information, which does what its name suggests, and that site information is used if and when there is a claim for physical conditions on site, where the actual conditions encountered are compared to a number of things, one of them being the site information. There are other documents that might be included in a contract depending which options you've included. You can see some examples there. I'll skip past this, but that's there in the slides for you to refer to after today. Now, I'm going to talk now about the actions of the parties and others and how important these are to make sure that disputes are avoided. All NEC contracts start with the same, or broadly the same, two contracts, but everybody involved in the contract must act as stated. So any action that's given to a person in the contract has to be done by that person, and they have to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. And that talks about the approach that the parties will have to the contract. In a small number of places, this contract requires the parties to cooperate and to liaise with one another, but in most situations it doesn't. And even where it doesn't, they still should cooperate and make a lot of these processes a lot easier. Communications in the contract have to be done in a prescribed manner. They have to be in a form that can be read, copied and recorded. That means they could be on paper, they could be on email. More usually, we find in our projects, we use what NEC contracts call a communication system. So online project management systems that incorporate document transmittal, communications and so on. And clause 13.2 says that where a communication system is specified in the scope, that becomes the only way to communicate between the parties. Almost everything in this contract has a time limit attached to it in terms of communications, and this thing called the period for reply is stated in the contract data as the default period for responding to communications if one isn't already stated. And finally, you can see here, anything that's classed as a notification, and they tend to be the more important communications in NEC contracts, and also certificates, have to be communicated separately from other communications so that they stand out. So early warnings. Early warning mechanisms in contracts aren't new, and NEC isn't the only contract to include them, but they are very detailed provisions to help the parties be forewarned of difficult issues. So the contract requires the contractor and the project manager to notify each other of early warnings of anything that could do one of those four bullets you can see there. And effectively, they are cost, time, and quality. They have to give an early warning in that situation. It is an obligation. So there is no more keeping quiet about potential problems because you think that may give your party an advantage in later commercial processes. There is an obligation to do this. There is also an optional action where the PM or the contractor may give an early warning of something that would help the contractor reduce its total cost. That would avoid something increasing their total cost, sorry. And all early warnings are put in something called the early warning register, which is a list of all of the early warnings that have been notified and that are current. So it means that both parties then have a list of the issues, the risks that they need to be concerned about at the moment. Once an early warning has been notified, either party can instruct the other to attend what we call an early warning meeting. So it's not often in a contract like this you see the ability of the contractor to instruct the client to do something, but the contractor can instruct the project manager to come to an early warning meeting to try and avoid whatever the problem is entirely, or at least to reduce its impact. And after the meeting, when it's been agreed what's going to be done, the early warning register is amended by the project manager and reissued. The aim of this process is to facilitate collaboration and to ensure that the parties are managing the risks that the project faces. Subcontractors can come to those meetings if their attendance would be helpful, and those who attend are there to try and get rid of the problem entirely, and if not, to reduce it. Now, design is something that traditionally causes us a great deal of difficulty if it's not done well, and design is often something that is not well defined in contracts. and is not given sufficient time for the process to occur. So where the contractor has design obligations, they need to be stated clearly within the scope. The contract says that the contractor designs those things which the scope says they are to design. In the absence of any statement like that, the default has to be that the client will provide the design. But where the contractor has an obligation to design part or all of the works, they cannot construct anything they have designed themselves until the project manager has accepted the design. So this is an opportunity for the project manager on behalf of the client to make sure that what is constructed is what the client wants, and avoids the type of dispute you get that once something has been built and the client says, well, I didn't want it to look like that. There is the opportunity for the client to sign off on design before something is constructed. Design liability is a major issue. Do contractors have the obligation to build something that's fit for purpose, or do they have a more limited design liability? There's a secondary option in this contract that reduces the contractor's design liability to reasonable skill and care. And that's very helpful at better defining the contractor's liability and usually bringing that liability within the reach of professional indemnity insurance. Now, the program is key to NEC contracts. They go into far more detail on program issues than any other standard form that I've ever come across. And the NEC drafters do that with no apologies. It's on the basis that if you manage the program properly, you've got a much better chance of bringing your project back on, bringing it to a conclusion on time. So the first program, and I say the first one because programs are regularly replaced in this contract, the first one can be submitted with the tender or after the contract is formed. There's a long list of things that the program submission has to include, including the order and timing of the things the contractor will be doing, but also the order and timing of the work of the client and others that the contractor is basing their program on. They have to demonstrate their provisions for float, for time risk allowances, and they have to provide method statements with their program submissions. So the program submission is likely to be much more than a bar chart. It's likely to be a mixture of lots of different documents. Now, every program, once revised, has to be submitted to the project manager for acceptance. And the project manager has to accept the program within 2 weeks of its submission, or to notify the contractor the reasons for not accepting it. As with all of the decisions the project manager makes in this contract, there are reasons in the contract that allow the project manager to say that they're not accepting a program, and to do so without any further contractual obligation. The reasons are largely that the program doesn't comply with the contract or it's not realistic. As with many other processes, and this does avoid disputes, the project manager has a limited time to do this, and if the project manager doesn't reply within 2 weeks, the contractor can issue the project manager with a reminder, and if the project manager is still silent a week after that reminder, the program is treated as accepted. So this process will not stop merely because the project manager doesn't take part in it properly. And every program accepted by the project manager becomes what we call the accepted program, and that then supersedes previous ones. So the aim here is to keep the program up to date, reflecting all of the changes that have happened to the project since the start. So the program is updated whenever the project manager instructs the contractor to do it, whenever the contractor chooses to do it, and at least as often as stated in the contract data. So this keeps the program up to date. It then, you'll see shortly, becomes a major part of the change management process. So we have so many debates in our industry about the impact of delay, disruption, time-related costs, The programming issues here are designed partly to manage your project effectively, but partly to ensure that there is a much better defined change management process, particularly when it comes to assessing the effects of change. Now, defects can cause a lot of difficulties, and the response, or possibly the lack of response, of the contractor to defects really does cause us difficulties. So I'm not going to say much on defects, just a few highlights that aim to manage the defects process and avoid defects turning into disputes. All defects have to be corrected within a defined period. The contractor is not allowed to take as long as they want, potentially a year or two, to remedy defects. If defects remain uncorrected, then the contractor will have to pay the client the amount it would cost the client to get those defects corrected. The period after completion, during which defects have to be corrected, ends at a defined time. It does not go on indefinitely whilst the contractor takes as long as they want correcting defects. The contract contains a process where defects can be accepted by agreement. Typically, the defect does not get corrected and the contractor pays an amount to the client. And all of these things are aimed at resolving defects promptly and leaving fewer possibilities for disputes. Now, payments are at the heart of all contracts and they are always involved in disputes. And we can do so much to improve projects by making sure everybody in the supply chain gets paid about the right amount of money and on time. So the contract defines when payment is made. The project manager has to assess payment and certify it within a week of a defined date. That defined date is called the assessment date. The project manager certifies within a week, and the payment is made by the client within 3 weeks of the assessment date or other period. The contract data allows the client to change that period of 3 weeks to something else. The contractor has to submit an application for payment before the assessment date, otherwise it does not get paid at all in this payment cycle. There is a final assessment process which is designed to draw all of the payment issues to a conclusion shortly after what we call the defects date. The defects date is identified in the contract. Typically it's 52 weeks after completion, not always, but that's a very common period. And the contract requires the project manager to assess the final amount due and to certify it no later than 4 weeks after the defect certificate is issued, which is usually around the defects date. So typically this would be 56 weeks after completion. Or in the event we've got termination, within 13 weeks after termination. If the PM doesn't make that assessment, the contractor can do it and issue that assessment directly to the client. And the contract says that whoever's made that assessment, that becomes final unless one of the parties disputes it. And then if one of the parties disputes it, they have a limited time to take the dispute to dispute resolution. And therefore the parties are forced into either agreeing a final assessment or taking it to dispute resolution within a fixed period after the end of the project, rather than, as many of you may frequently see, that these debates can run on for years after the completion of projects. Now, compensation events are, as the name suggests, events that entitle a contractor to be compensated for the effect on time and money of specified events that are at the client's risk. There is a defined process to either agree the effect of a compensation event or to have that imposed on the contractor. And once again, there are time limits here, and where one of the parties does not adhere to time limits, it can be quite costly for them in the long run. So if the project manager and the contractor cooperate with one another, then this will be a much easier process. Now, this is a very simplified chart given the limited time we have today, but the compensation event process starts off with the obvious question: is there a compensation event? Has something happened that is a compensation event? Those compensation events are listed in various parts of the contract, and I think off the top of my head there's about 25, 26 of them in various places. And so before we invest any time in looking at delay analysis or financial analysis, we get to ask the question: is there a compensation event? Either the project manager or the contractor notify the other that there is a compensation event. In most situations, the contractor is instructed to prepare a quotation, first of all, showing the effect of time and money, and the assessment of both of those things is set out in the assessment. I've called them the assessment rules. That's not their correct title in the contract, from clause 63. Once the contractor has submitted a quotation, there's a time limit for that, as you can imagine. The project manager has to accept that quotation or not accept it, again within a defined period, which is 2 weeks. And if the project manager says, I don't accept the decision, they can either get the contractor to prepare a revised quotation, or the project manager can make their own assessment and impose that on the contractor. Once we get either an accepted quotation or an assessment that's been imposed on the contractor by the project manager, those prices are implemented into the contract, and the only route to amending the assessments is through dispute resolution or a change to the contract. So all the way through the journey on that big red arrow, you have time limits and you have people being coerced into a particular piece of behavior by the contract on the basis that there is a sanction if they don't. So dealing with compensation events, everything has a time limit, absolutely everything in compensation events. There are sanctions for the contractor and the project manager for their failure to comply with timescales, and the assessments that are made are final except for dispute resolution or as a change to the contract. So it brings compensation events to a conclusion, and hopefully the majority of them are assessed in a manner that both parties will agree, and therefore they do not lead into any further debate or dispute. So finally, some recommendations from me when you're using NEC contracts. As I said before, do what it says in a contract. Whatever the actions are, do it, and do it on time. Use the processes to your advantage. Don't view them as a painful administrative burden. View them as good things you should be doing to manage your project effectively. Select the right people to run your projects, and if their behavior identifies that they're not the right people, then get rid of the wrong people. It's cheaper in the long run, believe me. Encourage other people and embrace the early warning process, and ensure that everybody complies with the program obligations. All of the time aspects of compensation events are made relative to the accepted program. That has to be kept up to date and it has to be accurate. If you are the client, pay the contractor the right amount of money and do it on time. And that means the project manager has to certify payments on time. Deal with problems well before they become disputes. Many disputes have festered, have caused difficulty for many months or even years sometimes before they come to me as a dispute. And you look at what's happened over time and you can see how they could have been so much easier and so much better resolved. Use the senior representatives to keep the dispute in your own control, and only take your dispute to the adjudicator or the tribunal as a last resort. So that's a bit quick, but I know we've got limited time, so that's me done, Fanny. So back to you.
Thank you, Patrick, for setting the scene with very detailed explanations and recommendations on how to avoid and solve disputes under NEC 4. So we may come back to you later on with questions, but now we will turn to Augusto and Alvaro to try and illustrate what you have just described with very concrete applications with projects in Peru. So I will first introduce Augusto. Augusto is country manager and director of GLID in Peru with a background of civil engineer. He has experience in PMOs, dispute boards, FIDI contracts, and he is a member of the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. He has more than 30 years of experience in public infrastructure projects and with direct experience managing standard contracts. He worked in Lima 2019 as infrastructure leader and project manager of one of the first 5 NEC contracts used in Peru. And in 2020, he was in charge of the infrastructure of the Peruvian pavilion for Expo 2020 in Dubai. Since 2021, he is working as advisor of the Peruvian government in government-to-government agreements for the ARCC ANIN, bicentennial schools, and in a portfolio of highly complex hospitals for a total of more than $10 billion in infrastructure since 2020. I will also introduce Alvaro. So Alvaro Bergdorf is an industrial civil engineer. He went from analyst to general manager of Grupo Flesan in only 5 years, leading operations in Peru with high specialization in the execution of NEC contracts. He is focused on digitalization, optimizes efficiency, and he founded Gestiona.io to promote business management and leadership, aspiring to be a benchmark in the sector. So thank you both to be with us today to share your experience in Peru. And my first question to you two would be, how do you see in your day-to-day operations applying traditional contracts versus NEC? So what are the main differences and what is meant by collaborative and collaboration between the parties involved?
Many thanks, Fanny. Maybe you can start, Alvaro, because you are the contractor, so your experience probably is more rich than a simple advisor like me.
¿Qué tal? Hola, buenos días desde Perú. Muchas gracias por la invitación. A ver, efectivamente hay diferencias sustanciales entre un contrato estandarizado, independiente de sea NEC, etcétera, el concepto de un contrato estandarizado respecto a la variabilidad que puede tener un contrato bajo las necesidades que puede generar cada cliente. Por lo tanto, a nosotros como contratistas facilita bastante la capacidad de gestión el tener algo estandarizado como primero gran beneficio. Si hoy día nosotros miramos en el macro como Grupo Flesan y de Vicente en Perú, estamos ejecutando desde defensas ribereñas, hospitales y colegios en paralelo, todos en contratos NEC, y finalmente, aunque sean alcances muy distintos unos con los otros, podemos gobernarlos bajo una misma lógica contractual, bajo una misma lógica de gestión de riesgos, y eso es un beneficio muy importante de cara al contratista en su capacidad de gestión, en las economías de escala que se pueden generar con la gestión, etc. Y por otro lado, también el nivel de certidumbre o la reducción de incertidumbre debido a la gestión del riesgo durante la ejecución del contrato, la implementación del dispute board y esta lógica que explicaba Patrick de evitar escalar el conflicto, facilita mucho las cosas, sobre todo en la administración pública, que se necesita tener de mucha estructura y de sustento ante Contraloría y ante todo un proceso, digamos, reglamentado, que un contrato con estructura y con seguimiento constante como son los NEC, facilitan finalmente también la toma de decisiones para un funcionario público. Entonces esas cosas son siempre muy positivas. Hay cosas un poquito más difíciles y la particularidad de Perú o algunas problemas de interpretación al contrato, que es donde viene precisamente Glitz y otras empresas del Reino Unido a apoyar en esa asesoría técnica para el correcto uso e implementación del contrato, y ahí nos puede contar un poco Augusto de ese proceso de acompañamiento un poco que hemos tenido, porque una cosa es lo que dice escrito, una cosa es lo que dice el espíritu y otra cosa es lo que pueden hacer las personas. Entonces, el desafío, digamos, de la asesoría técnica es precisamente tratar de hacer conversar lo más posible el espíritu del contrato, lo escrito, con lo que se ejecuta en las decisiones reales, digamos. Ahí complementa un poco a gusto de lo que ha sido.
Yo estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que ha dicho Álvaro, y solo reforzaría que esto ha sido todo un camino, porque claro, el contrato tiene un ADN distinto, pero hablando con colegas que han sido contract managers también en el Reino Unido, me dicen que los temas y problemas son similares allá. Es decir, el contrato apela a un espíritu de colaboración, apela a que el project manager haga su tarea tal y cual dice el contrato, pero las personas finalmente siempre pueden interpretar y siempre pueden querer ejecutar el contrato de acuerdo a su sentido y no necesariamente a lo que dice el contrato. Entonces yo, por eso lo que dice Álvaro, pero en todo caso, si esto se ha ido implantando en Perú es porque ha habido una asistencia técnica que así lo ha ido realizando. En mi caso, la primera vez yo fui parte del cliente y tuve esa asistencia técnica. Ahora me toca ser parte de esa asistencia técnica a los principalmente project managers que, como sabemos, en Perú hasta ahora se ha tomado la decisión, porque el sector público es el que más contratos ha tenido, y se ha tomado la decisión de que los project managers sean empleados del cliente. Pero, como siempre digo, los project managers tienen que pensar que si bien son empleados del cliente, deben actuar como project managers y no son el cliente. Así que ese trabajo ha sido muy interesante. Sin embargo, como resalto lo que dice Álvaro, el tener un contrato estándar y un contrato estándar de espíritu colaborativo permite realmente que las cosas en el día a día vayan mejorando respecto de cómo desarrollar un proyecto de alta complejidad que con una simple suma alzada ahora sería muy difícil llevar a cabo, más aún si es una suma alzada que el cliente elaboró y no es un contrato estándar que en realidad fue hecho por un gremio de independientes o de profesionales como es el Instituto de Ingenieros Civiles de Reino Unido. Eso es lo que yo opinaría de tu pregunta, Fanny.
Maybe I just have one additional question that came to my mind listening to what you say. Here in Europe, we tend to say that NEC contracts are mostly recommended when the projects are very complex. I mean, big amounts, very complex projects. But when I look at what Alvaro is doing in Peru, they are very complex hospitals, etc., but maybe less complex schools or building projects. So would you consider that using a NEC form is also relevant, taking the advantage of the collaborative aspects also for smaller and less complex projects, or do you tend to keep it for very complex projects?
A ver, nosotros particularmente como Grupo Flesan hemos usado, siempre me lo corrige Augusto, pero en general de la totalidad de contratos, de los diferentes tipos, de las formas de pago de los contratos del A al F, digamos, hemos usado creo que todos, excepto uno, que es el de precios unitarios con precio objetivo. Creo que, no me acuerdo, ahí el otro día tú me decías, Augusto, cuál era el único que no habíamos ocupado, y lo hemos ocupado en contratos desde 20 millones de soles o 15 millones de soles hasta contratos de 1.400 millones de soles. Por lo tanto, en la magnitud del monto o la complejidad creo que no son excluyentes, pero la realidad sí es que el esfuerzo que requiere un proyecto, un contrato NEC, por la gestión que implica, efectivamente hace que el precio tenga que ser de mayor complejidad o de un requerimiento técnico que te justifique efectivamente tener lo que implica, digamos. Hay alguien que está con audio, parece. Entonces, el esfuerzo que implica la gestión del contrato sí te puede llevar a tender a que tengan que ser contratos de mayor complejidad, pero no es una limitante, digamos. Creo que en todos los espectros de contratos, en todos los tipos de contratos, se puede usar, y tiene que ver más con cómo se gestiona el contrato, más con las cláusulas de alcance del contrato, la complejidad que se le pone, más que el hecho de usar un contrato estandarizado con reglas claras y con un procedimiento establecido. Si obviamente uno establece cláusulas de alcance complejas, el contrato se vuelve más complejo. Y yo creo que ahí es donde hay que diferenciar el requerimiento técnico del alcance con la estandarización del contrato y las cláusulas estandarizadas del contrato. La realidad es que en Perú hemos usado contratos NEC con cláusulas de alcance de alta complejidad y de mayor rigurosidad y requerimiento, como por ejemplo el caso del BIM, que en Perú el uso de los contratos NEC ha subido el estándar BIM, porque la exigencia BIM de lo que está establecido en las cláusulas del alcance son muy exigentes. Pero eso no es porque el contrato NEC así lo pida, es porque el cliente así lo quiso establecer en el alcance. Porque perfectamente se puede haber sido un contrato NEC y haber puesto en la cláusula de alcance que el lot fuese un lot 200. Solamente que el cliente puso que fuese un lot 400. Pero eso no es por el contrato NEC, eso es por el alcance del contrato. Entonces no hay que confundir que por el uso de un contrato NEC o por el uso de un contrato estandarizado vamos a representar alcances complejos. El alcance lo va a determinar siempre el cliente. Y ahí es parte de lo que también hay que ir madurando en el uso. No que uno diga, voy a usar un contrato NEC, significa que tiene todas estas cláusulas de alcance, porque así venimos trabajando en los últimos años, pero eso es una particularidad del cliente y no del contrato. Y solamente para cerrar, y ahí puede complementar un poco Augusto, lo que es nosotros, independientes del contrato, y ahora en relación a lo que comentaba del alcance, la industria de la construcción en Perú ha mejorado muchísimo su estándar debido a esa exigencia mayor a nivel de alcance. Independiente de quién sea el responsable, digamos, en macro, sí ha ayudado la exigencia de alcance más elevada a subir el estándar, digamos, a nivel nacional de la forma de trabajo, desde los profesionales que se requieren, desde el manejo técnico del contrato, etcétera, ha hecho que en general la industria mejore su estándar. Pero, a contraparte de eso, ha hecho que la industria se vuelva más costosa. Hoy día los proyectos en general son más costosos, no solamente por el contrato, sino que post pandemia, o sea, hay un montón de factores que hacen que la construcción sea más costosa en los últimos 5 años, ha crecido exponencialmente en el costo en los últimos 5 años, pero adicionalmente a eso se le suma que Perú pasó de un subestándar a un sobreestándar si uno lo mirara en comparativo con la región. Hoy día nosotros somos una empresa que opera en Chile y en Perú, y en algunas partes yo te diría que el estándar de Perú es más alto que el estándar de Chile debido a este uso de estos contratos, como en el caso del alcance BIM. El alcance BIM, hoy día creo que es Perú, sin medio equivocarme, tiene mejor requerimiento técnico y mejor capacidad técnica de la gestión BIM que la que tiene los contratos en Chile.
Pues yo quisiera hacer un comentario, si me permite, Fanny, empezando por lo último. Es muy interesante escuchar a un vecino de la región, que es de Chile, hablar de lo bueno que estamos haciendo las cosas por Perú. Si bien yo represento una empresa británica, soy peruano y creo lo mismo que dice Álvaro, y solo reforzaría en tu pregunta de que este contrato ha permitido, bien planteado y bien asistido técnicamente por empresas británicas que llegaron originalmente como Mace, como Arup, ahora está Glitz, ahora estamos trabajando con Curry & Brown, con Acon, va a permitir y ha permitido que tengamos justamente los dispute boards, que tengamos justamente una palabra como el riesgo, que antes ni siquiera la tocaban los clientes. Y no estamos hablando solamente del cliente del sector público, también estamos hablando del cliente del sector privado. El evento compensable es una herramienta que supera al típico adicional tan sencillo de la suma alzada que siempre utilizamos en Perú, y el Open Book, que no es otra cosa del resultado de esos cambios de precios y esos cambios de fechas que se manejan en este tipo de contrato. Entonces, corroboro todo lo que ha dicho Álvaro y solo agregaría que el contrato ha permitido ese incremento de nivel que ha mencionado Álvaro que está sucediendo en Perú. Probablemente no en todo los miles de millones de dólares que hay de infraestructura que se tiene que hacer, pero por lo menos en unos 10 o 12 mil millones de dólares se está usando estas capacidades y esta performance bastante más alta que lo que normalmente usábamos.
Thank you. And maybe just to continue on this conversation, do you see this trend also in the rest of Latin America, or for now it's mainly in Peru? And also you mentioned dispute boards. Can you talk about your experience in dispute boards with NEC contracts? Have you experimented it already? And can you give us your thoughts on this, please?
Álvaro.
Sí. A ver, respecto a la región, para mí vendría muy bien que la región se contagie del ejemplo que ha hecho Perú, porque el conflicto en general, o el desafío, para no hablar de conflicto, el desafío en general en la industria de la construcción es global. Caso de éxito y ejemplo es que un contrato hecho en Inglaterra sirve en Perú, como sirve en Francia o puede servir en Dubái. Eso es porque la industria de la construcción, digamos, no tiene fronteras para efectos de la capacidad de gestión. Y Sudamérica tiene además un desafío importante asociado a la corrupción y a la falta de confianza entre el Estado y el privado. Y el contrato NEC apela precisamente a la confianza y al espíritu colaborativo, gobernar, digamos, un proyecto. Entonces, en mi opinión, lo que yo veo es que en los proyectos que nosotros hemos estado, la confianza entre las partes al menos se va construyendo y se gestiona cuando la inexistencia de estos métodos de dispute board o de manejo de alertas tempranas, etcétera, las partes ni siquiera generaban un lazo de confianza. Ahora de repente se rompe ese lazo de confianza, pasan cosas, pero al menos que exista un puente potencial de confianza es mucho mejor que la inexistencia total. Y eso a Chile le vendría muy bien, a Brasil le vendría muy bien, a Argentina le vendría muy bien, por lo tanto, es más que los gobiernos se atrevan a dar el paso que ha dado Perú, y es un buen ejemplo, y debiesen darle ese paso, porque también el conocimiento es colectivo. Nosotros somos una empresa que opera en Chile y en Perú. Las 20 empresas que están usando hoy día contratos NEC, o 30 empresas que están usando contratos NEC, sin temor a equivocarme, todas son regionales, todas están en Ecuador, están en Uruguay, o están en Argentina, o están en Chile. Creo, sin temor a equivocarme, que no debe haber ninguna empresa que sea solamente que tenga operación únicamente en Perú. Por lo tanto, el conocimiento ya es global. Hoy día, si es que se implementara un contrato NEC en Chile, Grupo Flesanes tendría la capacidad ya instalada para poder gestionarlo. O si se implementara en Uruguay, lo tendría SACEM, y si se implementara en Ecuador, lo tendría RIPCONCIF. O sea, hay ya un conocimiento regional de parte de los contratistas, al menos. Por lo tanto, falta la otra parte, digamos. El contratista ya está preparado. Gracias a lo que ha hecho Perú, el contratista ya está preparado. Hoy día falta la contraparte que se prepare también. Y respecto a lo último, y para pasarle el punto a Augusto, respecto a los dispute board, en la experiencia de nosotros, ha resuelto conflictos. Sin embargo, se ha transformado en una forma de no tomar decisiones en la lógica del gerente de proyecto. Y eso es porque en la lógica del espíritu del contrato, y quizás también culturalmente por quienes lo escribieron, entienden que la responsabilidad que te da el cargo te da la responsabilidad de la toma de decisiones en función de lo que se describe. Y en este caso el contrato transfieren muchas responsabilidades al gerente de proyecto. Pero ese gerente de proyecto en un contexto distinto, legislativo y cultural, como es el caso de Perú, no tiene, digamos, el respaldo suficiente y las garantías legales suficientes como para tomar ese tipo de decisión. Entonces se bloquea y no toma las decisiones y finalmente lleva todo al board, no porque sea una disputa, sino que porque prefiere que sea un tercero el que tome la decisión para no enfrentarse él al riesgo. Y eso es un problema de la legislación, porque el gerente de proyecto tiene un conflicto que si toma una decisión y esa decisión la Contraloría no la comparte, se enfrenta a un juicio y a un riesgo civil y penal por esa decisión. En cambio, si es que lo escaló a un dispute board porque no tomó él la decisión y es un dispute board el que lo hace, se protege de esa interpretación. Pero eso hace que finalmente todas las decisiones terminen en una sumisión formal. Y eso está mal. Conceptualmente, no puede ser que un proyecto a cosas que ambas partes entienden y están de acuerdo se lleve al dispute board simplemente para que haya un tercero que derima una decisión que en verdad ya está tomada, simplemente para que quede el concepto de que fue un tercero el que tomó la decisión. Y eso es un mal uso del dispute board y es un mal uso de la gestión del riesgo, pero se entiende también que el gerente de proyecto, ante esa exposición de riesgo, como persona natural, digamos, decida simplemente no tomarlo. Y ahí hay un desafío asociado más a la gestión de Contraloría, a reglamentos internos y a otras cosas que escapan un poco al alcance del contrato NEC, sino que tienen que ver más con la forma en que se organizan los estados y las reglas del juego que se establecen para la contratación pública, etc. Que ahí Perú tiene un desafío muy grande todavía.
Empiezo por lo último que mencionó Álvaro. Vuelvo con el tema de que hace un poco singular el uso del NEC acá en Perú y conectado con los dispute boards, que es que todavía los project managers son empleados del cliente. Entonces, muchas veces esa relación no necesariamente es totalmente independiente, porque en el contrato tú tienes 4 roles, como probablemente Patrick dentro de su explicación decía. Tenemos al contratista, al cliente, al project manager y a la supervisión. El project manager no es el supervisor, perdón, el project manager no es el cliente no es el project manager. Entonces, si esos roles se separan, probablemente haya un poco menos de lo que menciona Álvaro, que es existente finalmente, ¿no? Y lo otro, ya solamente para hablar de los dispute boards, pues realmente ha sido un mecanismo que han venido también como el NEC a quedarse en el Perú. Tanto así que en la legislación peruana hablamos de Junta de Resolución de Disputas, y ese mecanismo se basa mucho en los modelos que se han estado utilizando en los contratos estándar, principalmente en el NEC. De hecho, antes de que viniera el NEC en el 2017-2018 para Lima 2019, los panamericanos, previo a eso, nosotros hemos tenido contratos FIDIC en Perú por muchos años, por muchos 20 o 30 años antes, pero la verdad es que yo no he visto que haya habido una visibilidad de que existieran dispute boards o dispute adjudication boards o dispute avoidance and adjudication boards. No la ha habido. Más bien, cuando llegaron los primeros 5 NEC por el contrato para Lima 2019, es que empezaron a ver este tipo de mecanismos que son una especie de médico de cabecera que permite que el cuerpo que es el proyecto dure a través del tiempo, que las partes de ese cuerpo que son el cliente, el project manager, el contratista y el supervisor logren avanzar y que no se detenga el trabajo. Si bien sabemos que el project manager siempre va a tener la última decisión dentro del contrato, siempre esa decisión puede ser objetada por el contratista, que podría ir a un dispute board a hablarlo porque no está de acuerdo con la decisión de ese project manager, que probablemente en ese caso en condicional no haya sido totalmente sólido, profesional, bien sustentado. Entonces, ese mecanismo que es el dispute board, hablando en positivo de él, permite que haya un tercero independiente que podría revisar la decisión del project manager si es que el project manager no ha actuado de acuerdo al contrato. Y eso sucede en Perú y entiendo que puede suceder en otros sitios también, porque al final el contrato estándar puede ser muy bien desarrollado, pero finalmente lo utilizan personas y las personas siempre pueden tener una subjetividad sobre el uso del contrato. Así que los dispute board, Fanny, han venido como el NEC a quedarse y están siendo bastante desarrollados en Perú. Lo único que nos falta es que así como el contratista ya entiende el NEC, el NEC, el cliente ya tiene sus asesores para entender el NEC, vamos a necesitar también que el tercero independiente, el dispute board, también tenga que tener experiencia en NEC o lograr un tipo de certificación como ya en Perú estamos logrando con los NEC-REC, es decir, con la certificación de Project Manager que da el NEC o Thomas Telford.
Thank you, Augusto. And it was also reminded in the chat that the NEC suite will be translated into Spanish. So I guess it will really help the developments and the spreading of these contract forms in the region. Maybe I will ask Patrick if he has any comments on what you have just described. I don't know if you could get the translation and.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the discussion started off with someone saying, do you just use NEC contracts on big projects or complicated ones? NEC's got a full range of contracts, and the one we've been talking about today is this one. It's quite a thick document, but it has a related contract called the Engineering and Construction Short Contract, which is written for contracts that aren't necessarily complex, don't require sophisticated management, and don't place significant risk on either party, but relies on many of the same principles of NEC contracts. So for those people wondering, why would we use this? Is our project sufficiently difficult to warrant it? You might be looking at the wrong NEC contract. There's a whole suite to choose from. In terms of encouraging the greater use of contracts, I think anywhere in the world, we need clients to take the lead, particularly in public procurement, where the formal nature of procurement means that the supply chain has a limited, if any, input into what the terms of contract look like. We need clients to say, we're going to do this in order for a new form of contract to become more commonly used. And the translation of NEC into Spanish, I think, would be a very good step. Earlier in my career, I worked a lot in multi-language environments, and we would have contracts translated from one language into another. We would then translate them back again as a check to find that we'd completely changed their meaning in certain places. And I think a single Spanish version of NEC would be tremendously helpful to people wanting to use it in South America or in any other Spanish-speaking places.
Thank you, Patrick. Augusto, Alvaro, do you have one last comment? It's already almost the end of this webinar, but if you wish to add a last comment on your side.
Por mi lado, nada más que agradecer, muy contento de que estemos hablando desde Francia, desde Reino Unido y desde Perú de los contratos NEC. Les comento que voy a tener la satisfacción de ser uno de los revisores de la versión en español, que es lo que ya se viene, con lo cual creo que ya hemos dado un enorme paso para que este contrato también se pueda utilizar con una sola versión, ya que hasta ahora los esfuerzos han sido de cada uno de los clientes. Creo que espacios como estos, Fanny, nos permiten compartir lo que está pasando de este lado del mundo, así como nos comparten lo que pasa en Singapur, lo que está pasando en Hong Kong, que son lugares donde ya el contrato NEC se utiliza como se utiliza en Perú. Entonces, solo agradecer mucho este espacio. Ojalá se repita este tipo de iniciativas para seguir conversando de nuestras experiencias. Muchas gracias.
Alvaro, would you like to add something?
Estás en mute, Álvaro.
Ahora sí, perdón. Nada más que agradecer la invitación y feliz de participar en este y en futuros eventos de este tipo de actividades. Ayudan a explicar lo que estamos haciendo y también de cara a los desafíos que implica entrar a nuevas regiones, no solo por el tipo de contrato, sino que también el efecto colateral que también tiene que funcionar del resto de los stakeholders que administran un proyecto. Hoy día los desafíos en Perú siguen siendo grandes, pero se ha logrado mucho avance. El contrato NEC ha venido a ayudar bastante y es bastante responsable de lo que se ha logrado a nivel del éxito de los proyectos. Sin embargo, todavía quedan partes por mejorar que tienen que ver con los que quizás no están, de hecho, en esta mesa de conversación, que tienen que ver más con el Estado, con las regulaciones, que todavía hay ahí un desafío importante de alinear la política y alinear las legislaciones, independiente de lo que puedan hacer los privados, digamos, para gestionar los proyectos. Así que invitarlos también a seguir apoyando a Perú y ser caso de éxito para el resto de Latinoamérica. Y nosotros muy orgullosos también como Grupo FLESAN de ser parte de eso y también ser un ejemplo y liderar en la industria con el uso del contrato NEC en Perú.
Thank you very much. It is very nice to hear about your very positive experience of NEC contracts in Peru and taking the time to share with the rest of us, of the contractors, communities, but also other stakeholders. I think the philosophy of these webinars, it is really to put together the different stakeholders of the industry to share different views and perspectives. So thank you to you, the three of you, to share your expertise, experience, and very practical considerations too. It's also good to listen from a different part of the world to see what's happening in the different geographies. So thank you very much. Thank you to the participants for your participation today. We will share, I think, Patrick, you agreed to share your slides, so we will be pleased to circulate your slides. We will also share with you the replay of this session when it is available. We always also upload our replays on our websites. And I would like also to inform you that the next episode will be on December 14 of this series, NEC CICA webinars to deal with the climate change clause, X29. So I hope you can also join us on this next occasion. So thank you very much, and I wish you a nice end of the day.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
No, gracias. Thank you.